Jungkook's voice cracked with fury. His fists clenched so tightly that his knuckles turned white. His breath came in ragged gasps, chest heaving as he glared at the man standing before him. Rain pounded the pavement, drenching them both in icy sheets. The distant wail of sirens filled the night air, mingling with the acrid scent of burnt metal and blood. Jimin stood motionless, his face shadowed by the flickering light of the burning wreckage behind them. The glow of the fire reflected in his wide, stunned eyes. His lips parted, but no words came out. Jungkook lunged forward, grabbing Jimin's collar with both hands. "Say something. Tell me you didn't do this." His voice broke, hoarse and raw. His body trembled, not just from the cold, but from the storm raging inside him. Jimin exhaled shakily, his hands raising in defense but not fighting back. "Jungkook, I don't." Jungkook's grip tightened. "I trusted you." His pulse roared in his ears, drowning out everything but his own pounding heartbeat. "Because of you, she's..." His voice caught, choked by emotion. He couldn't even say it. "Dead." Jimin's gaze faltered. His lips trembled, as if he was about to say something to explain. But before he could, flashing red and blue lights painted the night. The screech of tires on wet asphalt signaled the arrival of the police. "Step away!" an officer barked, gun drawn. Jungkook's hands loosened, but his glare never wavered. "I swear, Jimin," he whispered, voice laced with venom. "If you had anything to do with this, I'll make sure you pay." The rain continued to fall, drowning out Jimin's quiet, pained response. Hours earlier, the evening had been perfect, almost too perfect. Jungkook should have known something was wrong. The private rooftop party overlooked the city skyline, glittering with 1,000 lights. Laughter, clinking glasses, and the soft hum of music blended into the air. Jungkook stood near the edge, one hand loosely holding a glass of whiskey, the other tucked into his pocket. Thinking too much again? A teasing voice pulled him from his thoughts. He turned to see her. So he, the woman who had changed everything. Her dark eyes sparkled mischievously as she leaned against the railing, her delicate fingers tracing the rim of her glass. Jungkook smirked. "Maybe. Or maybe I'm just wondering how someone like you decided to waste her night with me." She rolled her eyes, bumping her shoulder against his. "I think you forget who chased after who, Mr. Jeon." Jungkook chuckled, feeling something warm settle in his chest. For the first time in a long while he was happy. He allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, things would be okay. Then he saw Jimin, standing a few feet away watching them, his expression unreadable. Their eyes met, and for a split second, something flashed across Jimin's face. Something unreadable, something dark. Jungkook's grip on his glass tightened. He'd known Jimin for years. They'd been through hell together. But lately, there was a distance between them. An unspoken tension that neither of them acknowledged. And now, watching the way Jimin's gaze lingered on Sohee, Jungkook felt a pit form in his stomach. Before he could say anything, Sohee leaned in, pressing a soft kiss against his jaw. "I'll be back," she murmured. "Don't go anywhere." He watched her walk away, her silhouette disappearing into the crowd. When he turned back, Jimin was gone. The rain hadn't stopped. It pounded against the glass windows of Jungkook's apartment, blurring the city lights beyond. The clock on the wall ticked away, each second dragging like an eternity. The apartment was silent, save for the occasional roll of thunder in the distance. Jungkook sat in the dimly lit living room, elbows resting on his knees, head bowed. His hands were still stained, blood, soot, remnants of the nightmare that had unfolded mere hours ago. His fingers twitched, remembering the heat of the flames, the way the explosion had thrown him back, the sight of her body trapped in the wreckage, motionless, dead. His jaw clenched. His mind kept replaying the image of Jimin standing there, just beyond the fire, as if he had known, as if he had been waiting. A knock at the door shattered the stillness. 3 sharp raps. Jungkook didn't move at first. His muscles were tense, his body coiled with the remnants of adrenaline that refused to fade. Then, slowly, he pushed himself up, each step toward the door feeling heavier than the last. He unlatched the lock. The door swung open. Namjoon stood there, rain-soaked, his usual composed expression replaced with something tense, something unreadable. Behind him, Taehyung lingered, hood up, eyes shadowed beneath its edge. Jungkook exhaled sharply. You heard. Namjoon stepped inside without a word, the weight of unspoken understanding hanging between them. Taehyung followed, closing the door behind him. Namjoon's voice was quiet, controlled. Jimin's gone. Jungkook's fingers curled into fists. Gone. Taehyung pulled back his hood, revealing damp strands of dark hair clinging to his forehead. His voice was laced with something unreadable. Disappeared. No one's seen him since the explosion. A slow, bitter laugh escaped Jungkook. Of course Jimin would vanish. The guilt must have been too much for him. Or maybe he was running because he knew what was coming. Namjoon sat on the couch, rubbing his temples. There's more. Jungkook didn't move, didn't speak. He just waited. Namjoon's eyes met his. The police are looking into you. Silence. Jungkook barely blinked. Someone tipped them off. Namjoon continued. They think you were involved. Jungkook exhaled through his nose, slow and controlled. He should have been surprised. He wasn't. Taehyung, still by the door, spoke up. The security footage from the parking garage, it's gone. Jungkook's eyes snapped to him. What? Taehyung nodded. Someone wiped it clean. No records of the explosion. No records of who was there before it happened. Jungkook's heartbeat quickened. Namjoon leaned forward, fingers laced. This wasn't just an accident, Jungkook. His voice dropped lower, heavier. Someone planned this. Jungkook's mind raced. If the footage was gone, that meant someone had access, someone who didn't want the truth coming out. His instincts screamed at him that Jimin was at the center of this, but the missing footage complicated everything. He took a slow breath. Who else was there that night? Taehyung exchanged a glance with Namjoon. A lot of people, Namjoon admitted, but someone stood out. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a small, crumpled photograph. He handed it to Jungkook. Jungkook took it, fingers smoothing over the damp paper. The image was slightly blurred, taken from a security camera feed, one that apparently no longer existed. But the person in the image was unmistakable. A woman, dressed in black, face half hidden beneath the brim of a hat. Jungkook's breath hitched. He knew her, not just as a passing stranger, not just as a guest at the party. He knew her, and she wasn't supposed to be there that night. Namjoon watched him carefully. Recognize her? Jungkook's throat was dry. He swallowed hard before nodding. Her name's Hannah. His voice was barely above a whisper. Taehyung's eyes darkened. Who is she to you? Jungkook's fingers tightened around the photograph. She's Sohee's sister. The past clawed its way into his mind, dragging him backward, forcing him to remember. Hannah had always been the shadow lingering behind Sohee, the colder, quieter counterpart to her warmth. Where Sohee was laughter and light, Hannah was mystery and silence. She had never trusted Jungkook, and she had made no effort to hide it. I know what you are, she had said to him once years ago. And I know what you've done. Jungkook had brushed her off then, dismissing her as paranoid. But now she had been at the scene of the explosion. And now Sohee was dead. His hands trembled. Jimin had been there too. But if Hannah was involved, if she had been watching from the shadows, was it possible Jimin was a victim in this? Was it possible he had been wrong? The thought made his stomach twist painfully. He turned back to Namjoon, voice tight. Where is she now? Namjoon's jaw tensed. No one knows. Of course. Just like Jimin, Hannah had disappeared. Jungkook exhaled slowly, forcing himself to think. He had spent the past hours convinced that Jimin was the one responsible, that he had betrayed him. But now the pieces weren't fitting together the way they should. The missing footage, the sudden police interest in Jungkook, Hannah's presence. This wasn't just about Jimin. This was bigger, and someone was pulling the strings. His eyes flickered to the window, where the rain continued to fall. One thing was clear. If he wanted answers, he couldn't sit here waiting for them. He had to find Jimin. And he had to find Hana. Before it was too late. The city pulsed with a restless energy, neon lights flickering against the wet pavement as the rain continued its relentless assault. The streets were alive with movement. Cars rushing by, people moving like shadows beneath their umbrellas, conversations blending into a dull hum. But none of it mattered to Jungkook. He stood beneath the awning of an old convenience store, hood pulled low, hands buried deep in the pockets of his black jacket. His eyes stayed fixed on the reflection in the glass window, watching, waiting. Across the street, a figure leaned casually against a lamppost, cigarette dangling between two fingers. Seokjin. Jungkook exhaled slowly. Seokjin was an enigma. Charming, intelligent, but dangerous in ways few understood. He had always been the kind of man who knew things before anyone else did, who could slip between the cracks of the world unnoticed. If anyone could find Jimin or Hana, it was him. Jungkook crossed the street without hesitation. Seokjin smirked as he approached, flicking the cigarette into the gutter. "Didn't think I'd see you so soon." His voice was smooth, effortless. Jungkook didn't waste time with pleasantries. "Where is he?" Seokjin's smile widened. "Which one?" Jungkook's patience was razor-thin. "Both." Seokjin studied him for a long moment before sighing. "Jimin's gone underground. Someone's helping him, but I haven't figured out who yet." He tilted his head slightly. "Hana's another story. She's not hiding. She's hunting." Jungkook's jaw tightened. "Hunting who?" Seokjin's gaze sharpened. "You." The words hit like a punch to the gut. Jungkook's mind raced. If Hana was after him, it meant she believed he was responsible for the explosion. But why? Did she think he had killed Sohee? Or was there something else? Something deeper? That he hadn't uncovered yet? Seokjin shoved his hands into his pockets, glancing around before lowering his voice. "She's not alone either. There's someone backing her. Someone with power." Jungkook's blood ran cold. "Who?" Seokjin hesitated. "I don't have a name yet, but I do have a location." Jungkook's heartbeat quickened. Seokjin pulled a small scrap of paper from his pocket and pressed it into Jungkook's hand. "An abandoned club in Itaewon. She's been seen there more than once." Jungkook's fingers tightened around the paper. Seokjin watched him carefully. "Be careful, Jungkook. You're walking into something bigger than you realize." Jungkook didn't respond. He was already turning away, his mind set. He had a target, and he wasn't going to stop until he found the truth. The club was nothing more than a decaying skeleton of what it once was. The neon sign above the entrance had long since burned out, leaving only faint traces of letters against rusted metal. The windows were shattered, glass crunching beneath Jungkook's boots as he stepped forward. Inside, the air was thick with dust and decay. The scent of old alcohol and mildew lingered in the darkness. He moved silently, weaving through the wreckage of overturned tables and broken chairs. His fingers brushed against the handle of the knife tucked beneath his jacket, a precaution, but a necessary one. Then movement. A shadow flickered at the edge of his vision. Jungkook turned sharply, muscles coiling, but it was too late. A figure stepped from the darkness, gun raised. Hana. Her face was emotionless, eyes dark and unreadable. The muzzle of the gun was steady, trained directly at his chest. Jungkook didn't move. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Hana exhaled slowly. "You shouldn't have come here." Jungkook's voice was low, controlled. "Neither should you." Her grip on the gun tightened. "You killed her." The accusation was a knife to the ribs. Jungkook met her gaze, searching for something. Doubt, hesitation, anything that could tell him she wasn't completely certain. But he found nothing. "I didn't," he said. Hana's expression didn't change. "Then prove it." Before Jungkook could respond, a sharp sound echoed through the empty club, footsteps. Hana reacted instantly, shifting slightly, gun still aimed at Jungkook but now aware of the new presence. From the shadows, another figure emerged. Jungkook's breath caught. Jimin. Alive. But he didn't look the same. His face was pale, shadows carved beneath his eyes, his usual easy demeanor replaced with something cold, something guarded. His eyes locked onto Jungkook's, and for a moment, the weight of everything hung between them. Then Jimin spoke. You have no idea what you're caught up in. Jungkook's fists clenched. Then tell me. Jimin hesitated. Then quietly, it's bigger than us. The silence inside the abandoned club was suffocating. The air was thick with tension, heavier than the dust swirling in the dim light. Jungkook didn't lower his guard. Neither did Jimin. They stood feet apart, shadows stretching long between them. Hannah was still holding the gun, her finger twitching slightly against the trigger, but her focus had shifted. Jungkook watched Jimin carefully, studying every flicker of emotion on his face. This wasn't the same man he had known for years. There was something hollow in his eyes, something fractured. Jimin spoke first. You shouldn't have come looking for me. Jungkook's voice was steady. And you shouldn't have run. A muscle in Jimin's jaw twitched. He turned his head slightly, just enough to glance at Hannah, and then back to Jungkook. This isn't what you think. Hannah's voice cut through the air. Don't listen to him. Jungkook didn't move, didn't breathe. Then tell me, Jimin. His voice was ice. Tell me what's going on before I decide that I was right all along. Jimin hesitated, just for a second, but Jungkook caught it. And then, the sound of metal clicking. Jungkook reacted instantly, shoving Hannah aside just as the first shot rang out. The bullet buried itself in the crumbling brick wall behind them. Another shot. Jimin was already moving, diving behind an overturned table as the club exploded into chaos. The shadows were alive now, figures emerging from the darkness, their movements quick and precise. Not random attackers, professionals. Jungkook rolled behind a broken bar counter, his pulse hammering against his ribs. He caught a glimpse of Hannah, crouched low, her gun now turned on the intruders. Jimin was on the opposite side of the room, pinned down. Jungkook's mind raced. This wasn't a coincidence. Someone had been waiting for them to show up. A voice echoed through the club, smooth, almost amused. Didn't think I'd find all three of you in one place. Jungkook's blood turned to ice. From the shadows, a man stepped forward, adjusting the cuffs of his black coat, as if this were just another casual business meeting. Yoongi. Jungkook's grip on his knife tightened. Min Yoongi was a ghost. A name spoken in hushed whispers. A man whose reach extended far beyond the city's underworld. He wasn't just powerful, he was untouchable. And now he was standing right in front of them. Jimin exhaled sharply, barely audible. Shit. Yoongi's gaze swept over the room before settling on Jungkook. His lips curled into a small, knowing smile. You've been busy. Jungkook didn't respond. His mind was calculating, assessing every possible exit, every weapon within reach. Yoongi tilted his head slightly. I have to say, Jungkook, I expected better from you. Getting caught up in all of this. He gestured vaguely toward Hannah and Jimin. Messy. Jungkook forced his voice to stay even. What do you want? Yoongi chuckled. A low, almost pleasant sound. Want. He stepped closer, his footsteps slow, deliberate. I want what I've always wanted. His eyes darkened. Control. Jungkook's stomach twisted. Hannah's voice was sharp. You were behind it, weren't you? Yoongi glanced at her, seemingly unimpressed. Define it. Jungkook's patience snapped. The explosion. So Yoongi's smirk didn't fade. Ah. He exhaled slowly. That was unfortunate. Jungkook moved before he could think. His knife was in his hand, his body a blur of motion. Yoongi's men reacted instantly. A fist slammed into Jungkook's ribs, knocking the air from his lungs. He staggered back, barely dodging another strike aimed for his face. Gunfire erupted again. Hannah and Jimin were already fighting, their movements swift and deadly. Jimin took down one attacker with a brutal kick, while Hannah's gun sent another crashing to the floor. Jungkook regained his footing, ducking low as he drove his knife into the side of the man closest to him. A strangled gasp, then dead weight collapsing onto him. Yoongi hadn't moved. He stood in the center of the chaos, watching with mild amusement. Then, he raised a single hand. And just like that, the gunfire stopped. Jungkook's breath was ragged, his body coiled, ready to strike again. But Yoongi only smiled. "You're not ready for the truth yet, Jungkook." His voice was almost gentle. "But don't worry." His eyes gleamed. "You will be." Then smoke. Thick, suffocating, filling the club in seconds. Jungkook coughed, eyes burning as he stumbled forward, trying to fight through the haze. By the time the air cleared, Yoongi was gone. And so was Jimin. The night was cold, the air thick with the scent of gunpowder and smoke. The abandoned club was silent now, save for the distant wail of sirens approaching from somewhere deep within the city. Jungkook stood in the wreckage, his breath unsteady, his fingers curled into fists. Yoongi had slipped through his grasp. Again. And worse, Jimin was gone. Hannah holstered her gun, her face unreadable. She wasn't looking at Jungkook, but at the blood pooling beneath the bodies on the floor. Namjoon arrived first. The roar of his motorcycle cut through the stillness, headlights casting long, jagged shadows across the broken furniture. He killed the engine and stepped off, surveying the destruction with a grim expression. His voice was calm, but there was a sharp edge beneath it. "What the hell happened?" Jungkook didn't answer. He was still staring at the place where Yoongi had stood, where Jimin had vanished into the smoke. Hannah spoke instead. "Yoongi was here." Namjoon's eyes flickered to her, then back to Jungkook. "And you let him walk away?" Jungkook's jaw clenched. Before he could respond, another figure approached from the alley. Taehyung. Unlike Namjoon, Taehyung wasn't alone. A woman followed closely behind him. Tall, sharp-eyed, her leather jacket worn and scuffed. Jungkook recognized her instantly. Lisa Manoban. A mercenary. An informant. Problem solver. She had no allegiances, only business interests. If she was here, it meant something had shifted. Lisa took one glance at the wreckage and let out a low whistle. "You sure know how to make a mess." Jungkook finally turned to face her. "Why are you here?" Lisa smirked. "Word on the street says someone's been looking for Jimin. Figured I'd drop in before you got yourselves killed." Hannah crossed her arms. "And what do you know?" Lisa's smirk faded. "That you're chasing ghosts." Jungkook's patience was razor-thin. "Be specific." Lisa exhaled, stepping closer. "Yoongi didn't just show up here by accident. He wanted you to come looking." Namjoon's gaze darkened. "Why?" Lisa shrugged. "Because Jimin wasn't just running." Her eyes locked onto Jungkook's. He was delivering a message. A cold weight settled in Jungkook's stomach. Lisa continued. "Yoongi isn't after you, Jungkook. He's using you." Jungkook's fists tightened. "For what?" Lisa hesitated. "For something bigger than Sohee." The name sent a jolt through him, but he forced himself to stay steady. Lisa lowered her voice. "There's another player in this game. Someone Yoongi answers to." Hannah stiffened. "Who?" Lisa hesitated again. And then, "The minister." The air seemed to freeze. Jungkook felt the words like a punch to the ribs. The minister. A name spoken only in whispers. A man who existed in the shadows, pulling strings from behind locked doors. No one knew his real name, no one had seen his face. But everyone knew one thing, he was untouchable. Namjoon exhaled sharply. "You're telling me Yoongi isn't at the top?" Lisa shook her head. "Not even close." Jungkook's pulse pounded. Everything he thought he knew. About Sohee's death, about Jimin's betrayal, about Yoongi's role in all of this was unraveling. Lisa glanced around. "You want answers?" Her voice was quiet. "Then you're going to have to make a deal." Hannah frowned. "With who?" Lisa's expression was unreadable. "With the devil himself." The meeting was set for midnight. A warehouse on the outskirts of the city, surrounded by shipping containers and the quiet hum of distant traffic. The air was thick with the scent of oil and rust. Jungkook arrived first, his mind sharp, every nerve alert. Hannah came next, followed by Namjoon and Taehyung. Lisa was already waiting, leaning against a car, arms crossed. They didn't have to wait long. The black SUV rolled to a stop, its tinted windows reflecting the dim streetlights. The doors opened. A man stepped out. Not Yoongi, not Jimin. Someone else. Someone Jungkook hadn't seen in years. Kim Sungmin. Jungkook's blood turned to ice. Sungmin had once been an ally, a friend even, but that was a lifetime ago. Now he was something else. Cleaner. Fixer. The minister's right hand. Sungmin's gaze swept over the group, pausing on Jungkook for a fraction of a second longer than the others. Then he smiled. Cold. Calculated. You've been asking all the wrong questions. Jungkook's fists clenched. Then give me the right ones. Sungmin tilted his head slightly. Why do you think so he died? Jungkook's breath caught. Because someone killed her. Sungmin's smile didn't waver. Wrong. The silence was deafening. Sungmin took a slow step forward. You're chasing revenge, Jungkook. But what if I told you? His voice was almost gentle. So he was never supposed to die that night? Jungkook felt the ground shift beneath him. He couldn't speak. Sungmin's eyes darkened. She was supposed to kill you. The words hung in the air like a blade suspended above Jungkook's throat. She was supposed to kill you. Jungkook didn't move. Didn't breathe. Sungmin's gaze remained steady, his expression unreadable. Around them, the night stretched silent, the warehouse looming in the background like a forgotten ruin. Hannah's fingers twitched near her holster. Namjoon shifted slightly, his stance tightening. Taehyung's eyes flickered with something unreadable. But Jungkook, he felt nothing. Nothing but the weight of Sungmin's words pressing down on him, cracking open something raw and buried deep. His voice was hoarse when he finally spoke. You're lying. Sungmin tilted his head slightly as if considering his response. Then he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small envelope. Jungkook didn't take it. Sungmin sighed, almost as if he had expected the reaction. Read it, he said, his voice infuriatingly calm. Then decide if I'm lying. Jungkook's fingers closed around the envelope before he could stop himself. The paper inside was old, slightly crumpled, ink faded at the edges. A letter. So he's handwriting. Jungkook. By the time you read this, you will already know the truth. His breath hitched. I never wanted to hurt you. That was never the plan. But I can't run from this anymore. Jungkook's grip tightened. The words blurred. His pulse roared in his ears. If I don't do this, they'll kill us both. He swallowed, forcing himself to keep reading. They told me to get close to you. To watch you. To learn everything about you. And when the time came, to finish it. His stomach twisted violently. But then I made a mistake. His hands shook. I fell in love with you. The air left his lungs. That's why I know they won't let me live. His vision blurred. Jungkook, if I don't make it, don't trust anyone. Especially him. His heart stopped. Minjungi. The letter slipped from his fingers. A long silence stretched between them. No one spoke. No one moved. Sungmin's voice was the first to break through. Now you understand. Jungkook's breath was ragged, his fists clenched so tightly his nails bit into his palms. His mind was a hurricane, everything crashing together, memories, lies, whispered promises, shattered truths. So he had been sent to kill him. She had betrayed him. And yet, in the end, she had tried to save him. Sungmin watched him carefully. Now do you see? His voice was softer now. You were never just a target, Jungkook. You were a threat. Jungkook forced himself to look up. A threat to who? Sungmin's lips curled into something almost like pity. To everyone. The weight of the words settled deep into Jungkook's bones. Namjoon finally spoke, his voice low. What do you want from us, Sungmin? Sungmin exhaled slowly. A deal. Hannah scoffed. We don't make deals with ghosts. Sungmin's gaze flickered to her. Then you'll all be dead by sunrise. Silence. Jungkook's hands were still shaking. He shoved them into his pockets, trying to steady himself. What kind of deal? Sungmin smiled. The only kind that will keep you alive. The room was small, dimly lit, the air thick with the scent of stale cigarettes and rain-soaked concrete. A hideout. One of many. Jungkook sat on the edge of the metal table, still gripping the remnants of Sohee's letter. Lisa leaned against the doorway, arms crossed. So, she drawled, now that we know your ex-girlfriend was a trained assassin, what's next? Jungkook didn't respond. Taehyung exhaled, running a hand through his hair. We don't even know if Sungmin's telling the truth. Hannah scoffed. You saw the letter. Lisa smirked. Letters can be forged. Namjoon shot her a warning glance. And if it's not? Lisa shrugged. Then we're all in deep shit. Jungkook's voice was quiet. We already are. Another silence. Lisa pushed off the wall, stepping closer. Look, I don't care about your past heartbreaks, but we have bigger problems. If so, he was working for Junggi and Junggi was answering to the minister. She paused. Then the minister already knows you're still alive. Jungkook met her gaze. He always did. Lisa studied him for a moment. Then slowly she smiled. Good, she said. Then let's make him regret it. The city never truly slept. Even in the dead of night, the hum of distant traffic and the flickering neon signs painted Seoul in cold, artificial light. Jungkook stood at the edge of a rooftop, the wind biting against his skin, eyes locked onto the skyline. Somewhere in that vast maze of steel and glass, the minister watched from the shadows. Lisa's words echoed in his mind. Then let's make him regret it. Easier said than done. Behind him, the others waited. Hannah leaned against the railing, arms crossed, her expression unreadable. Namjoon was checking his weapons, his movements precise, methodical. Taehyung exhaled smoke from his cigarette, watching Jungkook closely. And Lisa was smirking. You're thinking too much, she said. Jungkook didn't answer. Lisa pushed off the wall, stepping closer. We have a location. Jungkook turned to face her. Where? Lisa's grin widened. A club. Downtown. She held up a sleek black card between her fingers. Private event. Invitation only. Taehyung flicked away his cigarette. And let me guess, he drawled, it's hosted by someone who wants us dead? Lisa chuckled. Not just anyone. Her eyes gleamed. Junggi. Silence. Namjoon closed his gun case with a snap. It's a trap. Lisa shrugged. Obviously. Jungkook's jaw tightened. Then we spring it. Hannah glanced at him. You sure? Jungkook nodded. Taehyung sighed. Well, I guess we're all dying tonight. The club was buried in the heart of the city, hidden behind layers of exclusivity and power. The kind of place where only the untouchables played. Inside, the music pulsed through the floor, heavy bass reverberating through crystal chandeliers and velvet drapes. Men in tailored suits and women in silk dresses moved through the dimly lit lounge, their laughter edged with something sharp, knowledge, danger, secrets. Jungkook adjusted the cuff of his jacket, eyes scanning the crowd. The others had already slipped in, blending effortlessly. Lisa had taken to the bar, striking up a conversation with a man who looked too wealthy to be anything but corrupt. Namjoon and Hannah moved through the crowd, their hands never far from their weapons. Taehyung was at the poker table, all charm and deception. Jungkook exhaled slowly. Then, a presence. Cold. Familiar. Min Junggi. He stood near the VIP section, dressed in black, a glass of whiskey in his hand. When his eyes met Jungkook's, he smiled. Jungkook felt his fingers